In the end, what terrified them most wasn't that Sam Hart had died. It was that the desert had chosen how he would be remembered, not as a husband, a neighbor, a rancher, but as a man erased, reduced to fragments, his story written not in words, but in absence. Night has a way of sharpening fears the daylight only hints at. After the discovery of Sam Hart's truck, the arroyo took on a different life once the sun slipped behind the mesas. The wind carried low moans through the rocks, sounds that could almost be mistaken for a man's voice calling out. Coyotes circled at the edges, their yips rising and falling, their eyes glinting like embers in the dark. Locals who dared to stand near the crash site after sundown spoke of strange sensations. The smell of rust thick in the air, the taste of dust metallic on the tongue, the certainty that someone was standing just behind them, silent and waiting. A deputy who had been young during the original search, now gray-haired and retired, drove back out to the arroyo one evening. He parked his truck at the rim, left the engine off, and sat listening. He wanted to prove to himself that it was only memory, only grief that haunted the place. But as he stared into the gash of rock where the pickup still rusted, he swore the shadows moved differently there. Not with the easy sway of wind-blown branches, but with intention, curling, tightening, as if to close around the wreck. He lasted 10 minutes before slamming the truck into gear and driving until his hands stopped trembling on the wheel. The land itself seemed to resist closure. Officials had cleared the site, removed the fragments, cataloged the wreckage, yet each time the arroyo was left alone, it pulled back into its silence, as if shrugging off human intrusion. Dust settled, burying footprints, softening tire marks. The desert swallowed evidence, as though mocking the very idea of investigation. Rumors took deeper root. One story spread of a group of teenagers who sneaked out to the arroyo with flashlights. They told of hearing boot steps crunching in the gravel ahead, steady and deliberate, though their lights revealed another voice where he smelled cigarette smoke drifting thick around him, the same brand Sam Hart had smoked, sharp and acrid in the back of the throat. Terrified, they ran. Later, when they compared notes, they realized they had each heard their own name whispered, low and intimate, as if someone stood inches from their ear. The sheriff dismissed it as hysteria. The desert could play tricks. Sound carried oddly, smells lingered, fear warped perception. But the stories persisted, and with them the sense that Sam's disappearance had never ended. His absence was not a single event trapped in 1992. It was alive, still reaching into the present, still pulling at anyone who came too close. For the Hart family, the bone fragment offered no peace. Sam's brother refused to believe the official report. He said the tracks at the crash site suggested hesitation, as though Sam had driven forward slowly, not crashed by accident. He was led, the brother said, voice low, almost reverent. Something called him there. Margaret had gone to her grave clutching the belief that Sam would come home. Her children inherited her silence, carrying their father's name like a wound that refused to scar. 30 years of waiting had carved hollows in them that no answer could fill, because the answer was incomplete. What good is a hand bone to a son who grew up without a father? What comfort is rusted metal to a daughter who waited by the window every night as a child, hoping for headlights on the drive? The desert had given just enough to prove Sam had died, but never enough to explain why. In the end, what lingered most was the reflection, the way the case made people question the ground beneath their own feet. If a man like Sam Hart, sturdy as oak, could vanish so completely, what did that mean for anyone else? The desert was not just background. It was an active force, an antagonist with no face, no mercy. It pressed on the community like a suffocating weight, whispering that their lives, too, could be unmade in a moment, erased until only fragments remained. Even now, decades later, the ranch sits empty. The house sags against the horizon, its porch light shattered, its windows blind with dust. Travelers passing by swear the place carries a hum, low and steady, like a wire stretched too tight. Some say if you stop your car on the dirt road at night, you'll hear it. The faint creak of a screen door swinging open, the slow tread of boots across the porch. A sound that shouldn't exist, but does, carried on the breath of the land itself. The final cruelty of the desert was not the disappearance. It was the reminder. The reminder that absence can be louder than presence. that silence can echo longer than any voice. The drones may have solved the mystery of where Sam's truck lay hidden, but they solved nothing of what mattered. They did not explain why the desert waited 30 years to reveal its prize, or why it offered back only a fraction of the man it had taken. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the desert does not want to be solved. It wants to remind us of what we cannot know, cannot control. To walk its expanse is to accept that we are temporary, fragile, and at its mercy. Sam Hart's story ends as it began, with silence. A silence that hums in the bones of those who remember, that rattles in the winds across the plains, that clings to the arroyo where the truck still rusts. The vanished rancher of 1992 has become something more than a man. He is an echo, a caution, a shadow stretching across the desert night. And if you stand there long enough, in the dead heat of summer, with cicadas screaming and dust biting the back of your throat, you might hear it too. The sound of boots walking away from you, steady, relentless, until they fade into the endless dark. Time did not soften the story. If anything, the decades only sharpened it, carving grooves of unease into everyone who had lived through that summer of 1992. Sam Hart's name lingered like dust on the wind, impossible to see clearly, but impossible to escape. His absence had become part of the landscape, and for those who still spoke of him, the words came in hushed tones, as if the desert itself might be listening. Long after the drones uncovered the arroyo and the single fragment of bone, strange accounts continued to surface. A pair of hikers, drawn by the notoriety of the site, reported stumbling upon something they could not explain. They had been following the dry creek bed. One of them froze, pointing to a pattern in the sand. At first it looked like tire tracks, but as they crouched closer, the lines twisted unnaturally, spirals and loops with no beginning or end. They snapped photographs, but when they reviewed them later, the images were blurred, smeared as though the sand itself had refused to be captured. That night, in their motel, the hikers swore they smelled diesel fuel drifting through the air conditioner, acrid and choking, though the unit had never been serviced with such chemicals. Locals warned them, the desert doesn't like being watched, and the arroyo least of all. Former searchers, men now old and bent, spoke of things they had buried in silence. One admitted he had heard Margaret's voice calling his name during the search, though she had been miles away at the ranch. Another described finding a circle of stones arranged with deliberate care, each one stained with something dark he had convinced himself was rust. He never reported it, too afraid of ridicule. But he carried the image all his life, waking some nights with the phantom smell of iron thick in his nose. For Sam's children, adulthood came with an inheritance of dread. They had grown beneath the shadow of a father who had become myth rather than memory. Every milestone, graduations, weddings, births, was tinged by the empty chair where he should have sat. And when the drone footage aired on the local news, their children, Sam's grandchildren, watched in silence, eyes wide, as if glimpsing the outline of a ghost that had hovered over the family their whole lives. Closure was never real. How could it be when the desert had given so little? The bone fragment, cataloged and boxed in sterile evidence bags, was like a cruel joke. It mocked the family with its incompleteness, with the vast silence it represented. The truck itself, rusting deeper with every season, felt more like a tomb than a clue. It stood not as an explanation, but as a monument to the desert's appetite. Those who visited the site in later years often left unsettled. One woman claimed that as she leaned over the arroyo to look down at the wreck, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. When she pulled it out, the screen displayed a contact she had never entered. Sam Hart. She dropped the phone in panic, but when she picked it up again, the screen was blank, her contact list unaltered. Others spoke of hearing faint knocks against metal from below, though no one stood near the wreck. The sheriff's office stopped commenting on the case altogether. They filed their report, called it solved, and locked the paperwork away. But the community never accepted the neatness of that explanation. They had lived through the chaos, the grief, the suffocating dread. They knew the desert did not deal in neatness, and so Sam Hart's story became a kind of parable. Parents told it to children as a warning not to wander too far at night. Drifters paused at the arroyo to toss coins into the sand as though appeasing something unseen. The land itself seemed to change in people's minds, not an empty expanse, but an active force, a presence that demanded respect. Those who ignored that presence risked becoming another story, another absence folded into the silence. At night, when the cicadas screamed and the air shimmered with heat, some swore they could hear the low rumble of an engine far off, the sound of an old pickup idling just beyond the horizon. The noise would rise, then cut out abruptly, leaving only silence behind. A silence too deep, too deliberate. For the Hart family, grief became generational. Margaret had clung to hope until her final breath. Her children carried the burden of questions without answers, and their children inherited the unease. The knowledge that some stories do not end, they only echo. The desert had taken Sam, but it had also taken from them the certainty of safety, the comfort of truth, the illusion of closure. And perhaps that was the cruelest lesson of all. That the mystery was never meant to be solved. That the land itself had the final say. Not the law, not the drones, not the desperate hearts of those left behind. The desert does not return what it takes. It only offers fragments, glimpses, whispers that slip away as quickly as they appear. So Sam Hart remains. Not in body, not even in memory alone, but in the weight of absence that still presses against the community. He is in the wind that rattles loose tin at night, in the smell of rust carried unexpectedly on a cold gust, in the faint knock, knock, knock against rock that fades the moment you turn your head. He is in the silence, because the silence is never empty. And if you stand long enough at the edge of that arroyo, if you let the night swallow the world around you, you might hear it too, the sound of a man stepping away from his truck, boots pressing into gravel, walking steadily into the dark. No struggle, no panic, just a man answering a call that no one else could hear. The Vanished Rancher of 1992. Found but never returned, solved but never understood. His story lives on not in answers, but in questions that will never leave you. Because once you hear it, the silence of the desert never sounds the same again. The desert keeps its own kind of calendar, not measured in months or years, but in the steady erosion of stone, the shifting of dunes, the slow bleaching of bones no one will ever find. And yet, for those who remember the summer of 1992, time has moved differently. Fractured, stretched, always circling back to that single vanishing point where Sam Hart stepped out of his truck and dissolved into the night. 3 decades after his disappearance, the land around the arroyo looks unchanged. The same brittle brush clings to the edges, the same heat rises in shimmering curtains by day, the same wind scrapes through at dusk, carrying whispers no one wants to translate. But for those who stand there now, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what happened. Impossible not to sense the presence of a man who never truly left. There are those who believe Sam's story ended the moment he walked into the dark. That he succumbed to exhaustion or exposure or simply to the vastness of the desert itself. But others, quieter and more fearful, believe his vanishing was only the beginning, that he became part of something larger, something the desert holds close and does not share. Evidence is thin, but the stories persist. A Border Patrol officer, years after the case had gone cold, reported driving a lonely stretch of highway late one night when his headlights caught a figure walking along the shoulder. A man in dusty jeans, a hat pulled low. The officer slowed, ready to offer help, but when he blinked, the road was empty. He swore the figure had the same gait described by Sam's children, the heavy, deliberate stride of a man who had spent his life breaking land beneath the sun. The officer filed no report. He kept the memory to himself, cautiously, knowing what ridicule would follow. Truckers speak of strange interference on their radios near mile marker 47, static giving way to muffled fragments of a voice they cannot place. A drawl, tired but steady, sometimes just a name, Hart, sometimes only the low sound of breathing, drawn out until it dissolves into static again. And then there are the dreams. Countless people who never knew Sam claim to have woken in sweat after seeing him standing at the foot of their bed. Always the same image. Dust clinging to his shirt, eyes darkened by shadow, lips parted as if about to speak. But the words never come. He lingers only long enough for the dreamer to feel the press of something unbearable. Grief or warning or both, before vanishing into the kind of silence that is louder than any sound. What unsettles most is not the possibility that Sam Hart died lost in the desert. It is the possibility that he did not, that the desert chose him, drew him in, and keeps him still. The way the land has a hunger, quiet and patient, swallowing more than just bodies. It consumes time, truth, entire lives, leaving behind nothing but fragments sharp enough to wound. For Margaret's grandchildren, Sam is not a memory, but a haunting. They grow up hearing his story in whispers, sensing how their parents tense when the subject surfaces. At school, classmates repeat the rumors. The rancher who walked into the night, the truck that still bleeds rust, the drone footage that captured something not quite right in the shadows of the arroyo. The children learn to carry the silence the way their parents did, shoulders bent beneath a weight they cannot name. In town, the story has settled into legend. Some refuse to drive the old back roads after dark, claiming headlights cut through a fog that was never there before 1992. Others insist the land itself has changed, that nights feel longer now, that the air has a taste of iron, bitter on the tongue whenever the wind shifts east. The arroyo where the truck was found has become a place of uneasy pilgrimage, not a memorial, not exactly, but something darker. Those who stand at its edge say the silence there is wrong, too thick, too deliberate. Conversations falter, radios lose signal, phones drain their batteries in minutes, and always, always, there is the sense of being watched, not by something alive, but by something vast. Even the bone fragment recovered by the drones has taken on an aura of unease. Forensic reports locked it into evidence, but rumors say it has since gone missing. Some claim it was misplaced. Others whisper it was never real to begin with. A trick of the desert, offering a morsel just to deepen the hunger for truth. In the end, there is no closure. The word itself feels hollow here, like an insult to those who waited and searched and grieved until they had nothing left. What the desert gave was not closure, but a question sharpened over decades, a wound that never healed. And it is in that wound that Sam Hart remains alive. He is there in the knock of loose tin against an empty shed, in the low rumble of an engine that fades before you can place it, in the sudden stench of rust or diesel, carried on a wind that should smell only of dust. He is in the shadows at the edge of the arroyo, waiting, listening, reminding those who pass that the desert does not forget what it takes. And perhaps that is why his story will never settle into history. Because it is not finished, not really. Every silence is another page, every unanswered question another verse. And those who hear it, who stand at the edge of the arroyo or dream of the man in dust-stained jeans, become part of it. Another witness to a mystery that feeds on attention, growing stronger each time the story is told. Sam Hart did not simply vanish. He was absorbed into the land, into legend, into the marrow of those left behind. The vanished rancher of 1992 remains not as a man, but as an echo that refuses to fade. And tonight, if you find yourself driving a lonely stretch of desert road, windows down, air biting against your skin, listen closely. That faint sound you hear, boots on gravel, steady, deliberate, might just be the footsteps of a man who never made it home, a man who walked into the dark and became part of it forever. The desert does not give back. It only teaches you how silence can devour, how absence can become presence, how a single disappearance can echo through decades like the endless knocking of something unseen, just beyond the edge of light. And once you hear it, you will never unhear it. The desert holds more than bones. For those who searched for Sam Hart in those first blistering days of July 1992, the memory of that land clung to them for years, seeping into dreams, turning ordinary nights into haunted vigils. One of the deputies who scoured the arroyos later admitted he still woke drenched in sweat, convinced he could hear the drone of cicadas swelling in his ears like an electric current. Kai, convinced he was still out there walking circles in the sand, calling Sam's name into a silence that never answered back. In those early hours after Sam's truck was first discovered abandoned by the fence line, volunteers gathered at his ranch. Men with sun-seared faces and women carrying canteens crowded the porch, whispering beneath the low hum of insects. Margaret served them coffee, her hands trembling so badly the cups clinked against the saucers. The smell of burnt grounds filled the air, bitter and acrid, mixing with the musk of sweat and saddle leather. Someone suggested checking the cattle trails that snaked down toward the dry creek. Another muttered about the caves beyond the mesa, places coyotes dragged carcasses when the hunger got bad. The search went out in waves. Trucks roared down dirt paths, radios crackled, dogs barked, and yet hour after hour, the desert seemed to resist them. Every boot print they thought they spotted dissolved under shifting sand. Every echo of a man's voice was swallowed in the hot wind before it could carry far. At one point, a neighbor named Carl swore he heard a sharp knock against rock, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone pounding a fist for help. He sprinted toward the sound, lungs tearing with heat, but found nothing but stones and a rattlesnake coiled in the shade. The others told him it was heat stroke playing tricks. But Carl never forgot that sound. As panic spread, suspicion dug its claws deeper. Old rumors surfaced, whispers that Sam had debts tied to cattle deals gone wrong, that maybe someone had followed him out to the fence line. But the scene never matched foul play. There were no tire marks from another vehicle, no drag marks, no blood, just the abandoned truck, the keys waiting in the ignition as though Sam had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. By the third day, the mood of the search shifted from determination to dread. The volunteers grew quiet, conserving energy under the punishing sun. The smell of dust and diesel clung to their clothes. At night, when they returned to their beds, some admitted they still heard Sam's name whispered in the hiss of wind through mesquite branches. Others dreamed of his hat lying in the dirt, its shadow stretching impossibly long against the fading light. Margaret, meanwhile, sat alone on the porch swing, chains squealing softly as she rocked. Her eyes never left the horizon. Neighbors begged her to rest, but she shook her head. "He'll walk back," she murmured. "He always comes back." Her voice was flat, drained, as if each word cost her more strength than she could afford. Weeks turned into months. Searchers left. Helicopters stopped flying. The case went cold, but what was strangest of all was how quickly Sam's absence became part of the land. People driving past his ranch swore the air felt heavier there, as though something unseen pressed down on the skin. Cattle balked near the fence line where his truck had once been found, lowing nervously, eyes rolling white. Children whispered that if you stood by the arroyo at night, you could hear boots crunching in gravel just behind you, though when you turned, no one was there. And still, Margaret kept the porch light burning. The bulb buzzed in the darkness, moths tapping against the glass like fingernails. Some nights she swore she smelled him, the faint blend of tobacco smoke and sweat-worn leather drifting through the open window. She'd rise, heart pounding, only to find the yard empty, the desert stretching still and endless under the moon. Years passed. Neighbors died, new families moved in, but the story of Sam Hart remained. It grew twisted with retellings, sharpened by memory's cruelty. Some swore he had walked willingly into the desert, seeking something none of them could name. Others believed the land itself had claimed him, that there were places where the ground was thin, where a man could step through and never return. And then came the decades later rediscovery, the drones, the crash site, the single fragment of bone. But instead of soothing wounds, it ripped them open. Because the desert had not lied. It had hidden Sam, held him, then released only what it chose. The rest remained missing, as though the land refused to give him back whole. After the news broke, locals began visiting the arroyo. They stood on the ridge, peering down at the crumpled skeleton of the truck, listening to the hum of flies and the brittle whisper of sand shifting underfoot. Some said they felt dizzy near the site, as if the ground itself was tilting. One man collapsed and later swore he heard someone speaking his name in a low rasp as he drifted out of consciousness. The sheriff tried to stop people from trespassing, but the fascination was unstoppable. The place became a kind of shrine, not to Sam, but to what had consumed him. People left offerings, bottles of whiskey, cigarettes, old coins pressed into the sand. They lit candles at dusk, their flames trembling in the hot wind until they guttered out. The arroyo absorbed it all, indifferent, eternal. For those who had once known Sam, the discovery brought only deeper reflection. They remembered the steadiness in his eyes, the deliberate way he worked, the kindness tucked behind his silence. To imagine a man like that simply breaking apart in the desert felt impossible. And yet, when they looked at the rusted truck and the single bone, they felt it. An unease that slid down the spine, a certainty that something larger than them had decided Sam's fate.